Jackie Kennedy's marriage to JFK was not the love story America decided it was. It was something heavier, something that left marks. And once you see the actual shape of what Jacqueline Kennedy was living inside, the real architecture of that marriage, inside that building, inside that family, the glamorous image never quite closes back over it. The house does not belong to you. That is the first thing you need to understand. The address is yours, technically. Your name is on it in every newspaper in the country. But the building itself, the 132 rooms, the corridors that stretch far past any human need, the windows that face permanently outward toward cameras and crowds, none of it is yours. It belongs to the performance. And Jacqueline Kennedy understood this before she unpacked a single box. She had spent her adult life learning to inhabit spaces not designed for her comfort, the right schools, the right clothes, the right name attached to her own. And somewhere inside that long, careful navigation, the actual woman, the one who read Chekhov in French, who filled private notebooks with poetry, who had a precise and almost ferocious inner life, had learned to go very quiet. The White House gave that quietness a physical structure, 132 rooms. A full domestic staff that observed and reported upward, a press corps permanently at the gate, every morning beginning with the sound of her own heels against marble, that specific, hard sound that tells you, before coffee, before thought, that you are in a place built for ceremony and not for rest. Still air, then footsteps, then the whole performance beginning again. She was 29 years old when she moved in, recovering from a pregnancy that had ended in stillbirth 3 years earlier, pregnant again, standing inside a building where every window was a potential photograph, every corridor an observation, and every room a stage that did not stop being a stage when the audience went home, because the audience never went home. She described the White House in private correspondence, later examined by historians, as feeling not like a home, but like a museum she happened to sleep inside. She used the word impossible more than once, in more than one letter. The restoration project she launched in 1961 is always framed as her gift to the American people. But read J.B. West's memoir. West was the White House chief usher. He watched her work from the quiet corners of that building for years. What he describes is not a woman decorating rooms. What he describes is a woman building the one space inside 132 where the choices were entirely hers, not interior design, survival. Can you feel what that costs? 29 years old, the most watched woman in the Western world, grieving privately while performing publicly. In a building where silence was never just silence, it was always the silence before something was noticed, something was reported, something required managing. If stories like this one, the ones buried under 60 years of curated myth, matter to you, subscribe and share this with someone who still believes Camelot was what it looked like. Because the architecture was only the beginning, and what happened inside those walls is far furs. There is a specific kind of captivity that does not look like captivity. It is upholstered, photographed beautifully. It arrives with a motorcade and a couture wardrobe and a seat at every table where history is being made. But it operates, under all the silk, under all the ceremony, on one simple principle: you may not leave without permission, and the permission is never fully given. Jackie first met John Kennedy in 1951 at a Georgetown dinner party. She was 21, he was 34. Already a congressman, already carrying that particular Kennedy pull, humor that moved too fast, eye contact that meant something and nothing simultaneously, a room that rearranged itself around him without anyone noticing it had moved. She was drawn to him. That is not in dispute. But there is a distance between being drawn to a man and understanding the full cost of building your life inside his atmosphere. And Jackie, by multiple accounts gathered by biographers Sarah Bradford, Barbara Leeming, and Sally Bedell Smith, did not fully understand that cost until it was already being extracted. The infidelities began before the wedding, historically documented, not conjecture. Kennedy's relationships with other women were numerous, overlapping, and conducted with a casualness that people around him described in oral histories as nearly logistical. No particular anguish, no apparent internal conflict. It was simply a feature of his existence, managed like his chronic back pain, accommodated like his Addison's disease, never seriously treated as something requiring change. Jackie knew. Early, specifically, often, the names appearing across the historical record, Judith Campbell Exner, Mary Pinchot Meyer, Pamela Turnure, who served as her own press secretary, were not concealed with any real effort, simply not discussed. Because in the world she had married into, in the atmosphere the Kennedy family generated around itself, certain things were structurally unavailable for naming. Sit with that, knowing, with complete, precise clarity, the exact nature of what is happening inside your marriage. And knowing simultaneously that naming it, walking into the room where it lives and saying, "I see this, I am naming this is not acceptable," carries a cost so total that the calculation never resolves. The public marriage, the public children, the public image so consuming that there is almost no private self left underneath it to defend. That is not passivity. That is a person standing at the edge of their own interior life. Looking down, she built strategies, documented ones, extended stays at Glenora, the Virginia farm the family leased, away from Washington, away from the building, away from the Capitol's specific performance requirements. She rode, she painted, she read with a ferocity people around her consistently noted, not light reading, but the deep, consuming kind that signals a person using books as a place they can actually exist, without being observed existing. She also developed what those who watched her closely described as a learned ability to be physically present and simultaneously somewhere else entirely. To attend the dinner, wear the dress, stand at the correct angle for the cameras, and be, in some essential way, simply not there, body in the room. Self elsewhere, both at once, every time. This is what sustained management of the unmanageable looks like on a human body. From a sufficient distance, it resembles contentment, but within 18 months of moving into the White House, she was telling her personal physician she felt she was disappearing. Gone. Quietly. With the cameras still running, the staff watched everything, not as accusation, as operational reality. Running a residence of that scale, at that level of security and public exposure, required it. Every room had assigned people. Every movement through the residential floors was retained in the precise, professional memory of staff whose survival depended on anticipating the family's needs before they were spoken. J.B. West's memoir, Upstairs at the White House, is one of the quietly devastating documents of the Kennedy years. He writes in the careful, loyal language of a man who respected the family he served, but underneath the careful prose, what he is actually describing is a woman managing extraordinary private pain inside an environment where privacy was structurally impossible. Think about what it means to have no room that is fully your own. Not in the ownership sense. Jackie controlled her bedroom, her sitting room, her children's spaces. In the deeper sense, no room where a bad morning could simply be a bad morning. No space where exhaustion or grief or fury could exist without becoming, almost immediately, a piece of institutional information traveling upward through the observation chain, toward the people managing the presidency's public face. You do not need bars. You do not need locks. You need enough people watching, and enough institutional investment in the performance of your normalcy, and the enclosure builds itself out of attention alone. Cold marble underfoot, eyes at the edge of every room, always. Jackie responded with precision. She was, this is consistent across multiple first-hand accounts, intensely specific about who entered her personal spaces, when, and under what conditions. She managed her children's routines with a fierce protectiveness that put her in direct friction with Rose Kennedy, who had her own unambiguous ideas about how Kennedy children should be raised and displayed. The friction with Rose matters. It illuminates the exact shape of the trap. Rose Kennedy had navigated the same institution for decades longer. She had survived Joseph Kennedy's infidelities, conducted, by all historical accounts, with even less discretion than her sons, by building a form of personal dignity so armored, so sealed, so completely removed from the marriage's private reality, that it had become indistinguishable from peace. She had found her faith, her public role, a way to exist inside the Kennedy identity by becoming one of its structural walls. She expected Jackie to do the same, not through cruelty. Rose was not a cruel woman, but through the relentless daily modeling of the performance the role required, the appearances, the smiling, the practiced deflection of anything touching the marriage's interior. This is how we survive this. You perform it, until performing it is all there is. Jackie refused this solution, not always visibly. Open refusal, inside the Kennedy structure, carried real social costs. But through accumulation, small refusals compounding over time, she declined events, left early, disappeared to Hyannisport or Palm Beach when the schedule said Washington, built a low-level, ongoing insurgency of personal autonomy that the people around her consistently documented as willfulness. Difficulty, a quality of being hard to manage. But look at what is actually being described. A woman in her early 30s, in the most watched domestic role in American life, fighting for the right to have a morning that answered to her, fighting to be a mother on her own terms. Fighting for the right to close a door without that door's closing becoming a subject of institutional concern. Not a difficult woman, a person who has correctly identified that the structure around her is designed to replace her. She had 2 children who needed a mother, still recognizably herself. So she fought, quietly, persistently, at cost, for that version, even as the institution worked to replace it with a function. The function had a name, a face, a wardrobe, a press secretary. The function attended state dinners, stood at rope lines, smiled at the precisely calibrated angle. The function performed the idealized American marriage for a watching world. The woman inside the function went back to her room and read Edith Wharton, the novels about women who understand their situation completely and cannot move. She underlined passages. Biographers have confirmed this. Specific lines. About women who could see everything clearly and still had nowhere to go. Leave that detail alone for a moment. Do not move past it. A 32-year-old woman in the most photographed house in America, sitting with a book that described her own life back to her with more honesty than anyone in that building ever would. In less than 2 years, the thing she could not leave would be taken from her in 11 seconds on a Dallas street. And the leaving would happen to her instead. The fractures do not announce themselves. No single moment, no confrontation, no scene where the held thing is finally said and the room reorganizes around it. Instead, slow, cumulative erosion, a marriage wearing a person the way cold water wears stone. Not through force, through the daily, relentless pressure of contact. By 1962, Jackie had been First Lady for 18 months, 32 years old. She had already buried 1 child. She was managing her husband's public life, the surveillance of the institution, the friction with his family, and the specific psychological weight of a marriage, whose private reality she understood completely and could not address publicly. The walls knew, the staff knew, she knew they knew. Nobody said anything. The picture of her emotional state during this period arrives from several directions at once: private correspondence examined by historians, accounts from close friends including Bunny Mellon and her sister Lee Radziwill, and the institutional observations of staff members like West. What they describe collectively is a woman who has arrived at a specific, dangerous understanding that the strategies she built to manage her situation are not working: the physical distance, the controlled withdrawal, the books, the horses, the protected mornings. The erosion is continuing regardless. She was not visibly unraveling. That is the cruelest detail. From outside she looked composed, polished, in command of herself. From inside, in letters written during this period, she described the opposite: a person performing the idea of her own stability, every single day, from the moment the heels hit the marble. August 1963. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born 5.5 weeks early. He survived 39 hours. Multiple biographers identify Patrick's death as a rupture point, not only in its own devastating terms, but in what it did to the surface of the marriage. JFK, by accounts from people present at the hospital, was genuinely undone. Not managed, not composed, broken in the plain, ungoverned way of a person with no performance left. And Jackie, inside her own grief, witnessed something she had rarely seen her husband direct toward her: unguarded vulnerability. In the days after, they were physically closer than they had been in a long time, documented, observed by people in that building, and almost unbearably complicated to sit with. Because what it suggests is that underneath the institution, underneath the infidelities, and the managed distances, and the staffed corridors, there was something that might, under different circumstances, have become a real marriage. Two people who had moved through the same specific grief, who understood each other in a way no public image could hold. Whether that could have become sufficient, whether a second term, a private life after the presidency might have changed the shape of things, is a question history closes before answering. Dallas closed it first. What I was not prepared for, what genuinely unsettled me after going through the letters and the biographies and the oral histories, is how rational all of her choices were. That is the part I keep returning to at 2 a.m. She was not passive, not naive, not a woman who failed to understand what was happening to her. She understood it with extraordinary, almost painful clarity. She just also understood, with equal clarity, that every available exit cost more than she had: the children, the years already given. The public identity so fused to her private one that dismantling it would mean dismantling herself. So she managed. She found the smallest possible pockets of autonomy inside a structure designed to eliminate them, and she lived inside those pockets, and she kept going. That is not weakness. That is what extreme visibility and extreme institutional pressure actually extract from a person, paid quietly, daily, in the currency of their own interior life. The world watched every moment and saw only elegance. That is the loneliest sentence in this entire story. If the weight of what she carried is reaching you right now, subscribe. Share this with someone who still thinks Camelot was what the photograph showed. Because what happened next is where everything this story has been building toward finally arrives. By October 1963, Jackie had agreed to something she had actively resisted throughout the presidency: political travel. The Texas trip in November was organized in part because her presence polled exceptionally well. She was the asset the campaign needed deployed. This framing, the woman as deployable resource, as a feature of the political operation, was not new. It had been the operating logic of the marriage from nearly the beginning. She went. Pink suit, open motorcade, Dallas sunshine, crowds pressing toward the car on both sides of Elm Street. She smiled at them the way she had learned, over 3 years of relentless daily practice, to smile at crowds. And then 11 seconds collapsed everything. The fractures, the distances, the unfinished and genuinely real and terrible marriage, instantly and permanently irrelevant. She was no longer a wife navigating an institution. She was a widow navigating history. Within 72 hours, the apparatus that had consumed her private life for 3 years had a new requirement: that she perform grief in a way that served the myth she had always been a function of. The nation needed Camelot to mean something even now, especially now. And the woman who had spent 3 years learning to be present and absent simultaneously was the only person alive who could give them that. She was 34 years old. She did not refuse. The institution was not finished with her. It would not be finished with her for decades. She did not change the suit. 60 years of analysis, and it still carries its full weight. She stood in those clothes, the ones that held what Dallas had done, deliberately. She had decided, in the acute and terrible clarity that extreme shock sometimes carves open in a person, that the world should see what it had cost. Not performance, or rather, the moment when performance and absolute authenticity became the same thing. When the assembled public self and the devastated private self collapsed into a single image the watching world could not look away from. The cameras got exactly what they always got from her. This time it cost her everything to give it. In the days that followed, she managed the state funeral with a historical deliberateness that stunned everyone around her. Lincoln's funeral consulted, the riderless horse specified, the drum cadence, the eternal flame at Arlington. Decision after decision made from inside a grief so total that people present during those days describe her as existing slightly outside normal human time, moving through the requirements with a focused distance that looked, from outside, almost like control. It was not control. It was the final, complete expression of everything the White House years had built in her. How to move through a moment while the essential self waits somewhere quieter, somewhere further inside, for the moment to end. The moment did not end. The funeral closed. The cameras turned, briefly, elsewhere. And Jackie Kennedy was left standing inside the aftermath. Still young, still famous, still watched. The nation's grief projected onto her, like light onto a surface that had nothing left to reflect it. She was 34 years old, 2 small children. She had held her husband's head in her lap on Elm Street 48 hours ago. The institution required her to be something coherent now, something that helped the myth hold its shape. She was standing in a room she recognized completely, watched, required, performing a self she was no longer certain existed. The mirror still there, no reflection left to give it. She left. The entire story has been moving toward this, and it is both simpler and harder than it sounds. She left Washington, left the corridors and the marble and the institutional memory embedded in every room, moved to an apartment in New York and built, with a deliberateness people who knew her called almost ferocious, a life that answered primarily to herself. She was not finished being watched. She would never be finished. The cameras followed her everywhere for the remaining 30 years of her life. The image was not released simply because the institution had been. But the image was no longer the only thing. She became a book editor. A serious one, respected by writers, known for a genuine literary intelligence that the years of performance had never eliminated, only stored, waiting, in the same place she had stored everything else that belonged to her and had nowhere to go. She worked with authors including Toni Morrison. The people who sat across that desk described the woman the private letters and the underlined Wharton margins had always suggested was in there. Precise, curious, warm in ways that were entirely specific and entirely her own. The enclosure had not consumed her. It had tried, for 3 years inside that building, and for years after, inside the myth that refused to release her. It had tried. But the woman who learned to go quiet in rooms not designed for her had outlasted the institution that built those rooms around her, not without cost. There is no version of this story where the cost was not real and lasting. Something was taken during those years that does not come back. You can see it, sometimes, in photographs from the mid-1960s, a quality of watchfulness that never fully left her face, even in moments that were genuinely her own. But she built something on the other side anyway. She died in May 1994, 64 years old, non-Hodgkin lymphoma. At home, in her own apartment, surrounded by people she had chosen herself. Not in a building that belonged to a myth, not performing a role assigned before she was old enough to understand its terms. At home, on her own terms, after a life she fought, quietly, imperfectly, at real and lasting cost, to actually live as her own. Jacqueline Kennedy was not a symbol. She was a person who survived the sustained effort to make her one. If this gave you something the myth never did, share it. Subscribe for more stories told this way. Slow, honest, and unwilling to look away. She deserved that honesty. She still does.